Welcome. My name is Tim Gaydos. I'm the president of Together Washington. We are a civic organization here in Washington designed to build bridges across divides in our communities, in our cities. We believe that to be able to bring flourishing to our communities, we have to find ways to find common ground around differences. We're at a time, I think we'd all agree, that our society is divided, maybe more divided than any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. And the questions that we're asking are, how do we move forward? How do we find ways to build together, to be in relationship together, and to build that common good? And I am so excited for today because we have an opportunity to have a conversation with former governors of Washington, Dan Evans and Christine Gregoire. It's a true privilege to have both of you with us today. Thank you for joining us. Governor Gregoire served as the 22nd governor of Washington from 2005 to 2013. She is the second female governor of Washington, and she chaired the National Governors Association, as well as served on the Governor's Council of the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and recently had the privilege of helping to lead and start Challenge Seattle, which is an alliance of CEOs from 21 of the region's largest employers. And together, they're taking on the challenge of ensuring the greater Seattle area continues to thrive as one of the area's most vibrant, innovative, globally competitive regions in the world. Governor Dan Evans served as the 16th governor of Washington from 1965 to 1977, and as the United States Senator from Washington from 1983 to 1989. He has remained very engaged and active here locally, both in Seattle and in Washington. In 1999, the University of Washington renamed their School of Public Affairs after Dan Evans. That's the Dan Evans Public Policy Center. And he has been a lifelong commitment to public service, especially in areas of governance, education, and the environment. And the thing that I've always appreciated about both of them is that they have been coalition builders. We've seen that in their public life, that they have served in a way to build unconventional coalitions to serve the common good. So that's why I'm particularly excited about this conversation, as we have a Republican and a Democrat coming together to talk about what is the way forward. And so I'll just start with both of you and ask, how would you define the state of politics today? You both served for a long time here in our great state. And I'm curious your thoughts on what you see as the state of politics today. Governor Gregoire, I'll start with you.
Well, unfortunately, many people would say it's broken. And I refuse to accept it's broken. But boy, is it challenged, to say the least. And it looks like there's no means by which to find common good. And in fact, what one will be for, the other absolutely then must mandatorily be against. There's very little walk across the aisle and talk with each other. There's very little, how can we talk and have a cup of coffee and have me understand and listen to your point of view and vice versa. And those are the kinds of things that, frankly, I've grown up in politics, and I'm sad to see it go. As I look, and Senator Evans can speak to this better than I can, but I look at Washington, D.C., and I look at the fact that it's frowned on if you have even a cup of coffee with someone from the opposite party. They're not there on weekends anymore. They're not enjoying their families together or activities together. Those no personal relationships. Well, it's easy not only to disagree, but to be very disagreeable when you have no personal relationships at all. When you do have a personal relationship, more often than not, you can debate the policy without making it personal. And the opposite is what we see in DC. It's not just debating the policy. It's far too much of personal, really degrading personally to many folks. And that's because in my opinion, there's no personal relationship. So we need examples across the country that show we can, in fact, engage in conversation. We can listen, we can respect, we can learn. And if we do, I'll bet you anything, we can find common ground and we can make that work for the people that we serve.
Excellent. Thank you, Governor Evans.
It's interesting. I served long enough ago so that times were quite different. We had a 24-hour news cycle instead of a 2-minute news cycle, and we were in an era where those who were running newspapers, that was the major source of information, we're at a time when they very carefully distinguished between news and opinion. And the opinions were all on the opinion page, and the news was on the news page. And they're quite careful to not try to mix the two together. Today, I think that it's quite the opposite. It's hard to distinguish news from opinion, and many of those who purportedly are telling us the news are doing it from an opinionated base that is quite obvious. But many people say, "Well, gee, you were governor during the good old days." And I said, "You weren't around and don't know, because I've always said that politics is a contact sport. It's built on differences between people, and the difference was then between then and now that you could have horrendous differences on the floor or when you're in session, but you could leave them aside the instant that adjournment came. And your personal relationships often were with people on the opposite political party, but good friends just because they were good people, and you could divide the two, the online or on the floor compared with your personal relationships. And I think that's what's really gone now. The differences on the floor, the differences politically, have carried over now, and it's created a division that isn't eased by personal relationships. And I can describe the differences pretty accurately, I think. How to resolve them, not so easy.
Governor Gregoire, you mentioned something in your opening comments about relationship and how important relationship is, and it's easy to disagree with someone and be very, oppositional towards them. But there's something that happens when you actually sit down with someone and understand, where they're coming from, understand who they are as a person. And I think one of the things at Together Washington that are one of the beliefs is that, as a society, we flourish when actually people of different worldviews and backgrounds come together and actually work together and find those areas of common ground. And you've mentioned, and both of you have shown in your remarkable public life, how to build those types of coalitions and relationships. Is there something missing today that doesn't allow us to do that? Or how do we do that? And are there examples that you can share with us of how you've built across divides and built those types of relationships and coalitions?
So, all too often, what we see in Washington, D.C., and unfortunately, growing here in Washington State, is that you're criticized if, in fact, you engage with someone from the opposite party, whether you're engaging on a social in a social context or whether you're engaging on a policy. And we need to have people who are willing to buck that criticism and not have that thwart their willingness to get to know someone on the opposite side of the aisle. I'll give you an example. Governor Evans suggested there weren't recent ones, and I'll give you an example while I was in office, and that was we, in my second term, were challenged with the worst recession in history since the Great Depression. And we had reforms that had to be done, and quite frankly, should have been done a long time ago, but political factions had come into play. and thwarted the ability to make those bold steps. So I brought into my office the leadership of both the House and the Senate and R's and D's. And I remember being told very clearly by the D's, we're in the majority in both the House and the Senate. We don't need them. And my response to that was, we need to listen to them because they represent Washingtonians. And whatever we're going to do here has to be good for all Washingtonians, not just those from one party. And I also said something that I really firmly believe in, and that is, if we're going to take bold steps, bold changes, then you can't do it for so long as your party's in office. It's got to stand the test of time. And the only way to do that is engage all of us together and find common ground. Well, guess what happened? In almost every, and we did a lot of very bold reforms, in almost every occasion, we absolutely, in fact, in the end, we did in every occasion, find common ground. Everybody gave a little, everybody lost a little, and we found that common ground. And we passed all of those pieces of legislation. And I've been out of office now for 9 years, and not one of them has been repealed or attempted to be repealed. And to me, that says the outcome was best for all Washingtonians, which is how we should craft legislation. So there's an example to Governor Evans' point that's more recent, but what brought us together is the worst recession. And what I said when we all met is, this is not about politics. I could care less about politics. This is about how are we going to survive and get out of this recession, protecting the people of our state and readying ourselves to hit the ground running the minute we come out of it. And everybody agreed that was our ultimate goal. And then we went to work and found common ground in each of the respective reforms.
Did you find that the means were just as important or satisfying as the ends in any way, in terms of bringing the collective bringing together and just what that means? Because here we are, it's 9 years later, and we're talking about it, right? We're talking about those means towards what ended up happening. I mean, that's pretty powerful, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I will tell you, when you start with, we're going to put politics aside, we're in the worst recession other than the Depression. We owe it to the people of the state to ensure they all have a voice and they're all represented here. And we're all going to lose and we're all going to win on something we care about. But in the end, we're going to do what's right for all Washingtonians. Everybody invested. Everybody wanted to succeed. Everybody then built their relationships. We'd take a break. They'd be discussing things. They'd be having a good time, actually, under dire circumstances. And out of that, people became much more willing to give, much more willing not to get everything they wanted. And it was that process piece, that getting to know each other, that building of trust that resulted in a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Governor Evans, have you seen those types of examples? What comes to your mind when you think of those kind of coming together moments that really we need, I think, to kind of inspire us and move us towards some common goals and common causes?
Well, Chris mentioned the worst recession since the Great Depression. I'd matched the Boeing collapse during my time in office, being just about as bad. We had 13% unemployment, while the rest of the country was at about 6%. And one of the most fortunate things for us was that Senator Magnuson and Senator Jackson were two of the most senior senators in the majority in Washington, D.C., and were extraordinarily helpful. Their loyalty was to the state of Washington and to all the people in the state. So my relationships with those two senators was very strong and enabled us to do a lot of things. And I think one of the things, well, we really had differences, and sometimes they were big differences politically, that didn't prevent people from getting together. I think that's the biggest difference between then and now. is that you could have political differences and retain personal relationships. I remember vividly early on when I was in the Senate, and there were plenty of big differences at that time. But they had a private Senate dining room, or a dining alcove off the main Senate dining room, and it was just for senators. And they had just one rule, that if you opened the door to go in for lunch, you didn't look around to see who was there and then back off. You went in and ate lunch with whoever was there. And that turned out to be a marvelous interlude as far as I was concerned, because there were two big long tables in there separated by a little alcove, and Democrats usually sat at one table, Republicans at the other. But on occasion I'd go in and there were only 8 or 9 Democrats, and that was it. And so I'd sit down with them, and that was the most fun of all. Because we didn't talk about issues. We talked about our own home states. We got into some arguments about who had the best state to represent. But we found that a lot of the issues, we'd talk about issues, and the issues were, for the most part, not really partisan issues. And I found the same thing as governor. I never saw a Democratic highway or a Republican school. These were elements that were for everyone, and everybody knew that pretty well. And those were issues where it was easier to get together and to make real progress. Now, there were some issues that were more divisive and more political, and we'd confine our fights to those. But in even those issues, once the session was over, once you got off the floor or got away from the officialdom, personal relationships were very, very good. There were I had a lot of very good friends, both in the legislature and in the Senate, from the other side of the political aisle. And one thing and I never, like Chris, I never had a majority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate at the same time. In fact, I had Republican majorities in the House for 6 out of 12 years, and that was it. But we found that so many of the things that we were working on, if you really thought about them, even for a little time, you realize that they were not partisan to begin with. And to make them partisan was to invent something. And I'm afraid we've done a lot of invention in the last few years, and we've created conflict where none should exist.
Well, it's interesting. That's what we found at Together Washington. Our board is made up of, Republicans and Democrats. And we've seen that at the end of the day, we all really want and desire the same things as humans, right? We desire, you take say what's happening with homelessness. We all desire people to not be languishing in those conditions. And we want people to be taken care of and respected. And we all desire a lot of these same things. And just somehow we're stuck in figuring out how to, move forward and again, find that common ground. And, you both mentioned things around, coming together around in crisis or tough situations. And, recently we commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and of course, remembering how we did come together around that and how important that was. And I don't know if you had this thought or not about, wow, I mean, that was pretty special when in the sense of the unity that we had, and how beautiful it'd be to have that sort of unity again. And of course, we've been in a crisis for the last 18 months, and yet we have not been able to come together around, this COVID issue in a way that I think all of us would hope that we would have in such a tough situation. Why do you think that's the case? And is there a way forward as we're still in it?
So let me give you an example that's contrary to the idea that COVID has divided us totally. There's no question we've turned something that should be totally atypical politics into typical politics. We've used social media to disseminate misinformation, which is highly unfortunate and more challenging than when either Dan or I were in office, to be perfectly honest with you. But I represent these major companies, their CEOs. And I remember when we were trying to figure out how we were going to have the mass vaccinations, we asked for a meeting with the governor, and he granted that. There were 4 CEOs, myself and the governor. And I remember Kevin Johnson, the CEO of Starbucks, saying, "Governor, we deliver about 2 billion cups of coffee per week worldwide to satisfied customers. We're here to help you provide customer-friendly mass vaccination throughout the state of Washington." And each CEO said something and volunteered to help. To which the governor then said, "I can't thank you enough for volunteering. Let's go." And announced on Monday a public-private partnership that got national notoriety as being the most unique in the country, in which we accomplished exactly what we intended to do. But it could not have been accomplished by the private sector alone. It could not have been accomplished by the public sector alone. But when we came together, we absolutely could and did. And as I said to all at the end of the process, I said, it serves to tell us that when we work together, there's not a whole lot we can't accomplish. When we work divided, there's not a whole lot we can accomplish. And so I think that's an example in COVID. There were things where people really did. And it was a humanitarian effort by the business community who said, we have to do everything we can to provide for those who can't provide for themselves, to help government where government really doesn't have the means by which to do these things. So I know we've made it into a political issue, but look at how well we've done in the state of Washington. We have. Now, are we done? By no means are we done. Is it a political hot potato in our state? Of course it is. But we have nonetheless made some lemonade out of lemons when it came to this crisis.
That's powerful. Powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Governor Evans, any thoughts on that?
Well, we seem to come together better when we face a crisis. When times are good, everybody has a little more freedom to disagree if they choose to. We faced, I was in office about 3.5 years when the Boeing company virtually collapsed. We were sailing along pretty good. Unemployment rate statewide was under 4%. Boeing had 132,000 employees. And 6 months later, Boeing had 29,000 employees in the state. Statewide unemployment was over 13%. And the famous guys who built the billboard said, well, the last person in Seattle turn out the lights. And it was pretty brutal for a time, but out of all of that came growth, and it was a time when I found it easier to get together with the Democratic leaders in the legislature, along with the Republican leaders, and they all knew that we were facing a real crisis that required them to do more than just their normal political effort. And it was that working together that was, I think, really responsible for shortening the time of crisis and getting us back on the road to recovery, economic recovery. faster than we might have otherwise, because they all recognized that this was far too serious for political game playing. And everybody got together. We had some things happen during that time that even surprised me, that legislators from both parties, when I proposed a Jobs Now program, which was a way to give the governor authority to do some things that normally would have to be passed by the legislature, but they wanted to act faster and more flexibly. And the combination of Democratic and Republican legislative leaders passed a couple of big bills that gave to the governor the authority to really step forward and get some things accomplished to open up opportunity for new business and new enterprise to get started. Sometimes it takes a crisis like that to bring people together, but they did. They came together pretty well and shortened the length of time we were in deep crisis. And we came out of it faster and better than I thought we could have.
Powerful. Thanks for sharing that, Governor. As we begin to close our time, I wanted to, ask you here in our last remaining moments. Gathered here in Yakima is a collection of incredible, diverse leaders. As I mentioned at the top of our time, that Yakima in some ways represents a lot of what we see in our country. There's an article in the New York Times about how Yakima is a purple city, and there's those significant divides, and we have a great group of leaders, both who are grassroots leaders and also business CEOs, nonprofit leaders, who have come together across divides, and they're asking, how do we move forward? What does this look like for us? How can we work together? What would be your message to this group of Yakima leaders? Practically speaking, what would you say to them to say, hey, this is how you can see your community flourish? Governor Gregoire.
So, I would give them the example of what they've done historically. The old adage when it comes to water, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. Water is so critical to the economic prosperity and the survival, literally in Yakima and central Washington. We had been divided over this issue for how many decades? And we gave it a try, in which we brought the tribe together along with city, county, state, all of which disagreed at the time, the irrigators, the farmers, and so on. And we made immense progress. And the legislature didn't have the guts to say no when we asked for a large appropriation, because they were stunned that all of these groups had come together and said, we're going to do this together. The only way is we can make something happen if we put our differences aside for a brief moment and find a way so that we can get water for all of us. Because trying to do the way in which we're doing now, we're all going to lose. And I look back on that and say, Yakima Nation, the people of Yakima, the farmers, the irrigators, the environmentalists, it didn't matter what party you were, they all came together and they did it. So there's the model. Replicate what you did then. Do it again now. Find that common ground, because if you do, all of us prosper.
Well said. Well said. Governor Gregoire, you have another example that we think could really be helpful and insightful as we look across how we can begin to build bridges across divides.
Well, this is an example of how we can not only build bridges, but deal with issues where we ultimately cannot agree on something. And it was end of my second term, and the issue of marriage equality was before the legislature. Highly emotional, highly controversial. And it was going to be dealt in both chambers that day. National press were in Washington State to cover it. And I went to each of the four caucuses, the Republicans in the House and the Senate, the Democrats in the House and the Senate. And I said to them, I know there are differences. So let's voice those differences, but in a civil and respectful way. Let's all do what we feel is right in our hearts and in our minds, but let us be civil about it. Let us be respectful about it, because not only are our kids watching us, all of our state and our nation is watching us. And I will tell you, it was one of the more proud moments in my service as governor, as I watched this highly emotional and controversial issue debated on the floor of the House and the Senate with absolute civility and respect. And when it was done and it passed each house, they walked across the aisle with tears in many instances and hugged each other, proud that they had represented their constituents, said what they had to say, but done it in a way that was a model for the rest of the country.
Thank you for sharing that, Governor. Powerful. Governor Evans, when you think about giving a word to the Yakima Valley citizens and leaders, and as they look at ways to build together a diverse group across political spectrums and ideological spectrums, what would you encourage them or share with them practically?
Well, let me broaden it to the state, because interestingly enough, the state has changed politically in a remarkable way since I was involved. When I ran for governor, almost all of the differential between two candidates was in King County, where I won by almost 100,000 votes. No Republican will do that anytime soon in King County. But I could not carry any of the counties west of Puget Sound. They were all big logging communities, heavily Democratic and politically. And today, they are turning Republican. And of course, at the same time, King County has turned remarkably Democratic. So anyone who thinks that a particular area or a particular group of people will be something forever is headed for a real surprise, because things do change, and I think they will change again. Washington is not a blue state. It certainly isn't a red state. It is definitely purple, and it's the political parties generally are in command in one county or another, but they are certainly not the same counties they were 20 or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So change comes, and it comes because new people move in, and that leads to change. The issues themselves change and have differing effects on populations of one part of the state or another. But all of that does is reinforce the view that you ought to put, to the degree you can, political differences aside and focus on the issue in front of you, and see how well you can do. Usually that happens more easily in times of crisis than it does in good times. But I finally said in my third inaugural, I'd had enough experience with all of the political differences that were occurring. And I said that I would rather cross the political aisle than cross the people. And that was the piece of that inaugural address that was repeated most often for a longer period of time than anything else. Now, whether all of those involved in political office paid much attention to it or not, is another thing. But I think they did, and I think that we ended up with times, especially as I said, particularly in times of crisis. We all recognized that there were things that had to be done that at times were uncomfortable for one party, one political party, or the other. But those are the times when they would lay it aside, at least partially, and join together in a way to go after the crisis that was bigger than any political party and bigger than any political party could really handle.
Well said. Well said. Governors, is there anything I didn't ask that you think is important when it comes to this conversation of finding common ground in the midst of differences?
Not that I can see. I want to thank you for your leadership. Thank you for what you're doing. That is exactly what we need. And if with that kind of leadership and willingness to set our differences aside for what's right for everyone, there's nothing we can't accomplish.
Yeah. And I think that we are not going to see a real disappearance of political differences. That's what political parties and the whole political system is all about, to have differences of opinion and try to get your opinion or your policies adopted. But and that does not have to mean divorcing yourself from just social differences. Shouldn't be as big as political differences. People should be willing to get together, and they did at one time. I think both during Chris's time and mine. The people who served in political office could recognize the difference between political differences and social differences, and they could create good friendships across the aisle, which I am afraid are not happening now. That doesn't mean they can't; they just aren't. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things that Tim, we all can work on, is to try to find ways in which to divide the political difference from social difference.
Yeah, well said. Well, I know our leaders in Yakima are so encouraged that both of you governors took the time to be here with us today. And as a dad to 4 young daughters, I actually can't wait for them to watch this conversation between the two of you governors as a model, as an example, as words of wisdom that we can take, because I think that's what we ask, like what are we going to see in 20 or 30, 40 years when our kids and grandkids are older? And these are the type of examples you're providing, the kind of examples that we need here in our state and country. So I thank you for taking the time and sharing with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.